Happy day, students. Class 10 Social Science History Chapter 5. Let us discuss the chapter Print Culture and the Modern World History in detail. It is very difficult for us to imagine a world without a printed matter. We find evidence of print everywhere around us in books, journals, newspapers, prints of famous paintings, and also in everyday things like theater, programs, official curriculars, calendar, diaries, advertisements, cinema posters, at street corners. But what happens is we take for granted this world of print and often forget that there was a time before print. We may not realize that print itself has a history which was in fact shaped our contemporary world. So now let us move on. The earliest kind of print technology was developed in China, Japan, and Korea. This was a system of hand printing. It was done by rubbing paper against an inked surface of wood blocks. Now, this is called as woodblock printing and it was first developed in China. Please bear in mind, paper also was first developed in China. As both thin sides of the paper, which was very thin and porous, printing was not possible. Therefore, they used to print only on one side and stitch the papers together, and this gave birth to Chinese accordion books, which was folded type of books. Now, calligraphists made copies of these books. Now, calligraphy is the art of writing beautifully. Now, imperial state in China. Now, we know that the imperial state in China for a very long time was a major producer of printed material. Why? Because China possessed a huge bureaucratic system which enrolled its personnel through civil service examination. Now, to write an examination, they needed textbooks to be printed, and this act of printing textbook was sponsored by the imperial state. From the 16th century, the number of examination candidates went up, and this increased the volume of print. Now, if we see diversification of print in China. Now, not only the bureaucrats or the people who were appearing for civil service examinations were into reading printed material, but also other category of people were reading printed material. Like for example, merchants used print in their everyday life as they collected trade information. Reading increasingly became a leisure activity. The new readership preferred fictional narratives, poetries, autobiographies, anthologies of literary masterpieces, and romantic plays. Rich women also began to read. Now, since the demand for reading increased, Western printing techniques and mechanical presses were imported in the late 19th century as Western power established their imports in China. Buddhist missionaries from China introduced hand printing technology into Japan around 768 to 770 AD. The oldest Japanese book printed was in 868 AD, and it is the Buddhist Diamond Sutra containing 6 sheets of text and woodcut illustrations. Pictures were also printed on textiles, playing cards, and paper money. Now, since the demand for reading increased, libraries and bookstores were packed with handwritten material of various types like books on women, musical instrument, calculations, tea ceremony, flower arrangement, proper etiquette, cooking and famous places, and etc. Now let us go into print comes to Europe. Chinese paper reached Europe via Silk Route. Paper made possible the production of manuscripts carefully written by scribes. Now Marco Polo, a great explorer, returned to Italy after many years of exploration in China. He brought this knowledge back with him. Now Italians began producing books with woodblock and soon the technology spread to other parts of Europe. However, luxury editions were still handwritten on a parchment made from skin of animals which was called as vellum. As the demand for books increased, booksellers all over Europe began exporting books to many different countries. Now, this is a picture of Marco Polo, the Italian explorer, who brought the art of printing from China to Italy. Now, manuscripts were also in great demand, but however, manuscripts had a limitation. The production of handwritten manuscripts could not satisfy the ever increasing demand for books. Copying was expensive, laborious, and time consuming business. Manuscripts were fragile, awkward to handle, and could not be carried around or read easily. This circulation, therefore, remained limited. Now, therefore, there was clearly a great need for even quicker and cheaper reproduction of text. This could only be possible with the invention of a new print technology. Now, the breakthrough occurred in Germany, where Johann Guttenberg developed the first known printing press in 1430s. Let us know something about Johann Guttenberg. Guttenberg was the son of a merchant and he grew up on a large agricultural estate. From his childhood, he had seen wine and olive presses. Drawing on this knowledge, Guttenberg adopted existing technology to design his innovation. In 1448, Guttenberg perfected the system. The first book he printed was the Bible. About 180 copies were printed and it took 3 years to produce them. By the standards of the time, this was a very fast production. Here is a picture of Guttenberg. The print revolution and its impact. With the printing press, a new reading public emerged. Printing reduced the cost of books. Multiple copies could be produced with greater ease. Access to books created a new culture of reading. Common people lived in a world of oral culture. They heard sacred texts read out, ballads recited, and folk tales were narrated. Since not everybody was literate, printers began publishing popular ballads and folk tales and such books that could be easily profusely illustrated with pictures and can also be read out to the illiterate masses. Print created the possibility of a wide circulation of ideas and introduced a new world of debate and discussion. Even those who disagreed with established authorities could now print and circulate their ideas. Through the printed message, they could persuade people to think differently and move them into action. This had significantly affected different spheres of life. In 1517, the religious reformer Martin Luther wrote 95 theses criticizing many of the practices and rituals of the Roman Catholic Church. His work challenged the church to debate his ideas. This led to a division within the church and to the beginning of Protestant Reformation. Several scholars, in fact, think that the print brought about a new intellectual atmosphere and helped spread the new ideas that led to the Reformation. Print and dissent. Print and popular religious literature stimulated many distinctive individual interpretations of faith even among little educated working people. For example, in 17th century, Minocchio, a miller in Italy, began to read books that were available in his locality. He reinterpreted the message of Bible and formulated a view of God and creation that enraged the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Church, troubled by such efforts of popular reading and questioning of faith, imposed severe controls over publishing and booksellers and began to maintain an index of prohibited books from 1558. By the end of 18th century, in some parts of Europe, literacy rates were very high. As literacy and schools spread in European countries, there was a virtual reading mania. People wanted books to read and printers produced books in ever increasing number. Ideas of scientists and philosophers became more accessible to the common people. New ideas could be debated and shared with a wider target audience. New forms of literature. Booksellers employed peddlers who roamed around village carrying little books for sale. They were almanacs or ritual calendars along with ballads and folk tales. But other forms of reading matter, largely for entertainment, began to reach ordinary readers as well. In England, penny chapbooks were carried by petty peddlers known as chapmen and sold for a penny so that even the poor could buy them and read. In France were the bibliothèques blues, which were low-priced small books printed on poor quality paper and bound in cheap blue covers. Newspapers and journals carried information about wars and trade as well as news of development in other places. Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world. By the mid 18th century, there was a common conviction that books were a means of spreading progress and enlightenment. Many believed that books could change the world, liberate society from despotism and tyranny, and herald a time when reason and intellect could rule. Louis Sebastian Mercier, a novelist in 18th century, declared that the printing press is the most powerful engine of progress and public opinion is the force that will sweep away despotism in any way. Print and French Revolution. Many historians have argued that print culture created the condition within the French Revolution. Let us summarize these ideas in the form of points. First, print published and popularized the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers. Collectively, their writings provided a critical commentary on tradition, superstition, despotism. Next, print created a new culture of dialogue and debate. Within the public culture, new ideas of social revolution came into being. Next, in 1780s, there was an outpouring of literature that mocked the royalty and criticized their morality. Now you see that the culture has also affected children, women, and workers. As primary education became compulsory from the late 19th century, children became an important category of readers. Production of school textbooks became critical for the publishing industry. A children's press devoted to literature for children alone was set up in France in 1857. The Grimm brothers in Germany spent years compiling traditional folk tales gathered from peasants. Women became important as readers as well as writers. Lending libraries had been in existence from the 17th century onwards. In the 19th century, lending libraries in England became instruments for educating white collar workers, artisans, and lower middle class people. Further innovations. Through the 19th century, there was a Through the 19th century, there were a series of further innovations in printing technology. By the mid 19th century, Richard M. Hoe of New York had perfected the power driven cylindrical press. This was capable of printing 8,000 sheets per hour. In the late 19th century, the offset press was developed, which could print up to 6 colors at a time. From the turn of 20th century, electrically operated presses accelerated printing operations. A series of other developments also followed. Therefore, in 1920s in England, popular works were sold in cheap series called the shilling series. The dust cover or the book jacket is also a 20th century innovation. With the onset of Great Depression in 1930s, publishers feared a decline in book purchases. To sustain buying, they brought out cheap paperback editions. India and the world of print. The printing press first came to Goa with Portuguese missionaries in the mid 16th century. Jesuit priests learned Konkani and printed several tracts. By 1674, about 50 books had been printed in Konkani and in Kannada languages. From 1780, James Augustin Hickey began to edit Bengal Gazette, a weekly magazine that described itself as a commercial paper open to all but influenced by none. Hickey published a lot of advertisements, including those that related to the import of sale of slaves, but he also published a lot of gossip about the company's senior officials in India. Angered by this, Governor General Warren Hastings persecuted Hickey and encouraged the publication of official sanctioned newspapers only that could counter the flow of information that damaged the image of colonial government. There were Indians too who began to publish Indian newspapers. The first to appear was the weekly Bengal Gazette brought out by Gangadhar Bhattacharya, who was close to Raja Ram Mohan Roy. religious reforms, and public debates. To reach a wider audience, the ideas were printed in the everyday spoken language of ordinary people. Ram Mohan Roy published the Sambad Kaumidi from 1821, and the Hindu Orthodoxy commissioned the Samachar Chandrika to oppose his opinions. From 1822, two Persian newspapers were published, Jami Jahan Nama and Shamsul Akbar. In the same year, a Gujarati newspaper, the Bombay Samachar, made its appearance. In North India, the ulama were deeply anxious about the collapse of Muslim dynasties. They feared that colonial rule would encourage conversions, change the Muslim personal laws. To counter this, they used a cheap lithographic presses, published Persian and Urdu translations of holy scriptures, and printed religious newspapers and tracts. New forms of publication. Printing created an appetite for new kinds of writing. As more and more people could now read, they wanted to see their own life experiences, emotions, and relationships reflected in what they related. The novel, a literary form which was developed in Europe, catered to this need. It soon acquired distinctively Indian taste and style. For readers, it opened up new worlds of experience and gave a vivid sense of diversity of human lives. Painters like Raja Ravivarma produced images for mass circulation. By 1870s, caricatures and cartoons were being published in journals and newspapers commenting on social and political issues. Women in print. Lives and feelings of women began to be written in particularly vivid and intense ways. Liberal husbands and fathers began educating their women folk and sent them to school. But not all families were liberal. Conservative Hindus believed that a literate girl would be widowed, and Muslims feared that educated women would be corrupted by reading Urdu romances. In the next slide, you will see many women writers along with the works they have created like Rashundari Devi, Kailash Bashini Devi, Tarabai Shinde, Pandita Ramabai. You will also see in Punjab too, a similar folk literature was widely printed from the early 20th century. Ram Chadda published the fast-selling Stri Dharm Vichar to reach women how to be obedient wives. The Khalsa Tract Society published cheap booklets with a similar message. Print and the poor people. Very cheap small books were brought to markets in 19th century Madras towns and sold at crossroads, allowing poor people traveling to markets to buy them. Public libraries were set up from the early 19th century, expanding the access to books. From the late 19th century, issues of caste discrimination began to be written about in many printed tracts. Jyotiba Phule, the Maratha pioneer of low caste protest movements, wrote about the injustices of caste system in his Gulamgiri. In 20th century, B.R. Ambedkar in Maharashtra and E.M. Ramaswamy Naikar in Madras, better known as Periyar, wrote powerfully on caste, and their writings were read by people all over India. A Kanpur mill worker wrote and published Chote or Bade Ki Sawal, the poems of another Kanpur mill worker who wrote under the name of Sudarshan Chakra between 1935 and 1955 were brought together and published in a collection called Sachi Kavitaye. Before 1798, the colonial state under the East India Company was not too concerned with censorship. By 1820s, the Calcutta Supreme Court passed certain regulations to control press freedom, and the company began encouraging publication of newspapers that would celebrate British rule. After the revolt of 1857, a vernacular newspaper became assertively nationalistic. The colonial government began debating measures for stringent control. In 1878, the Vernacular Press Act was passed, modelled on the Irish press laws. It provided the government with extensive rights to censor reports and editorials in the vernacular press. From now on, the government kept a regular tract of vernacular newspapers published in different provinces. When a report was judged as seditious, the newspaper was warned, and if the warning was ignored, the press was liable to be seized and the printing machinery confiscated. But Despite repressive measures, the nationalist newspapers grew in number in all parts of India. Bal Gangadhar Tilak wrote with great sympathy about them in his newspaper Kesari. This led to his imprisonment in 1908, thus provoking in turn widespread protest all over India. So, with this, we come to the end of the lesson. Read the content that is given in the textbook. Thank you.